In 2025, Pope Francis made a chilling prediction about the future, and it's starting to unfold right before our eyes. In this video, we dive deep into the details of what the Pope foresaw, how it might affect our world, and the unsettling implications for the years ahead. Buckle up, because what's coming may leave you questioning everything. Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio, became the 266th Pope of the Catholic Church in 2013. Known for his humility, progressive views, and emphasis on social justice, Pope Francis quickly became one of the most influential religious figures in the world. But beyond his roles in guiding the Church, he has consistently expressed concern about the state of the world and its future. Over the years, he has warned about the dangers of unchecked materialism, the widening divide between the rich and poor, and the erosion of traditional values. However, in his speeches, he has also raised alarms about more specific events that might shape the future. One of the most striking aspects of his predictions is the forewarning of a catastrophic shift occurring around 2025. In numerous interviews, Pope Francis has highlighted a period of intense global transformation, societal, environmental, and economic, that would reach a tipping point in the mid-2020s. The Pope has spoken with an almost prophetic urgency about the fact that the world is heading toward a perfect storm of issues that could irreversibly alter the course of human history. His warnings are grounded in the spiritual concerns of the Church, but they also reflect a deep understanding of political, economic, and environmental crises. For the Pope, this isn't just a matter of spiritual preparation, but of survival and ethical responsibility. The Pope's prediction for 2025 is directly tied to his ongoing efforts to raise awareness about the inequalities facing humanity. His teachings often emphasize the need for reconciliation, understanding, and care for our planet. Yet they are also a stark critique of the greed and indifference that have led to the current state of affairs. His remarks point to the fact that this coming crisis is not just a natural event, but the product of human decisions. Decisions rooted in selfishness, neglect, and a failure to heed the warnings of previous generations. To understand the gravity of his prediction, one must first recognize that Pope Francis sees the signs of the coming transformation as deeply linked to the ways in which the global community has turned a blind eye to the most vulnerable among us. A major theme in Pope Francis's speeches is the alarming rise of secularism, materialism, and individualism. He has warned that humanity's increasing focus on wealth, status, and personal gain is tearing apart the social fabric that has traditionally bound people together. The Pope often stresses the importance of community, and without it, societies will inevitably falter. His call for a return to solidarity, compassion, and collective responsibility is seen as a countermeasure to the growing trend of isolationism and polarization. This is particularly concerning when considering how world events are unfolding. Nations are becoming more insular, prioritizing their own interests over international cooperation. The rise of nationalism, populism, and tribalism within powerful countries only makes the situation worse. Pope Francis believes that by the time 2025 arrives, these divisive forces will create a world that is more fractured and hostile than ever before. When examining the global landscape, it's impossible to ignore the increasing political instability and the rising tide of extremism that have been visible in the last few years. From the intensifying conflicts in the Middle East to the populist uprisings in Europe and the Americas, we are witnessing a breakdown of trust in traditional political institutions. Pope Francis has expressed concern that as power becomes more concentrated in the hands of a few, those in positions of influence may exploit their power to further entrench inequality. This dynamic, the Pope argues, leads to a vicious cycle where those who are already suffering are pushed further to the margins and social unrest becomes inevitable. The Vatican has long warned about the consequences of ignoring the ethical dimensions of economic and political life. Pope Francis's call for justice for the poor, the marginalized, and the environment is a stark reminder that the consequences of greed and neglect are not just spiritual. They are tangible, and they will have real-world effects. The Pope's warnings about 2025 are, in many ways, a reflection of his concern for the underprivileged and a response to the injustices that have accumulated over decades. Without a radical shift in consciousness and action, Pope Francis sees the future as one of even greater suffering. with no one remaining untouched by the waves of chaos that will ensue. The environmental crisis, a topic of particular importance for Pope Francis, is one of the most critical elements in his vision of 2025. The Pope has called climate change one of the principal challenges facing humanity and has warned of the devastating consequences if immediate action isn't taken. From the rapidly melting polar ice caps to the increasingly frequent and intense natural disasters, the evidence of environmental destruction is hard to ignore. Pope Francis has repeatedly emphasized that this environmental collapse is a direct result of human exploitation of natural resources, driven by an insatiable hunger for profit and growth. As the world continues to burn through its natural resources at an unsustainable rate, the consequences will become increasingly severe. Pope Francis sees the year 2025 as a critical point in this environmental battle, where humanity will be forced to confront the reality of its actions. In his papacy, Pope Francis has also sought to remind humanity that the earth is not ours to exploit, but a gift from God, a sacred trust that must be cared for and protected. The Pope's warning about the environment, then, is not just about climate change or rising sea levels. It is a moral and spiritual crisis. The earth itself is crying out for healing, and Pope Francis believes that humanity's failure to act will only bring about more severe consequences in the coming years. The 2025 prediction, when seen through this lens, becomes a call to action, a plea for humanity to choose a path of responsibility, humility, and restoration before it's too late. Pope Francis's view on the future is not simply an intellectual exercise, it's a moral imperative. As the global situation grows more dire, the Pope's warnings are becoming more urgent. His prediction for 2025 reflects his deep conviction that only a radical shift in human consciousness can prevent the inevitable collapse that awaits if current trends continue unchecked. The Pope has consistently said that this transformation cannot be avoided by simply addressing surface-level issues. It requires a spiritual awakening, a recognition that humanity must reconnect with its deeper values and take responsibility for the consequences of its actions. This call for a transformation of the human spirit is perhaps the most profound and unsettling aspect of Pope Francis's prediction. If humanity does not make this change, if we continue down the path of excess and self-interest, the coming years could be the beginning of a crisis unlike any we have ever seen. The combination of rising political extremism, environmental catastrophe, and the breakdown of social cohesion forms the bedrock of Pope Francis's predictions for 2025. This crisis is not just a distant possibility, it is already beginning to take shape, and the signs are all around us. Pope Francis urges us to take action now, to heed the warnings of the past, and to begin a journey of healing before the full force of the storm hits. The question remains, will we heed this call, or will we continue on the same path, heading toward a future that none of us can afford to ignore? Political turmoil has become one of the defining features of the 21st century, and Pope Francis has been outspoken about the dangers posed by growing instability in both developed and developing nations. Across the globe, traditional political systems are being tested by a surge in populist movements, nationalism, and authoritarian regimes. The Pope has repeatedly warned that political divisions and the breakdown of international cooperation are symptoms of a much larger crisis, one that threatens not only the social fabric of nations, but also the future of humanity itself. At the heart of Pope Francis's concerns is the growing divide between the wealthy and the poor, which he believes is fueling political polarization and social unrest. In many countries, the gap between the richest and the poorest citizens has reached unprecedented levels. Economic inequality has become a global phenomenon, with a small elite controlling an ever-increasing share of the world's wealth, while billions of people struggle to make ends meet. This stark inequality is not just an economic issue, it is also a political one. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few has led to the erosion of democratic institutions and the rise of populist movements that promise to challenge the status quo. Pope Francis has been particularly critical of the way in which economic systems prioritize profit over people. He argues that the global economic system is rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful, leaving the poor and marginalized to bear the brunt of its negative consequences. This, he believes, has created a political climate where those in power are increasingly disconnected from the realities of everyday life. As political leaders become more entrenched in their positions, they are less likely to address the needs of the most vulnerable. Instead, they focus on maintaining their power and advancing the interests of the wealthy elites who support them. In many parts of the world, this inequality has led to widespread disillusionment with traditional political parties and institutions. Voters, particularly in Western democracies, are increasingly turning to populist candidates who promise to shake up the system and restore power to the people. These movements, while appealing to those who feel left behind by globalization and economic change, often exploit fear, anger, and resentment to gain support. They promise simple solutions to complex problems, and in doing so, they further divide societies along lines of race, class, and nationality. Populism, in its most extreme form, can be dangerously divisive. Leaders who espouse populist rhetoric often target minority groups, scapegoating them for society's problems and inflaming existing prejudices. This has led to a rise in xenophobia, racism, and religious intolerance, further fragmenting societies and eroding the values of compassion and solidarity that Pope Francis holds dear. The rise of nationalism has also played a role in exacerbating these divisions, as countries become more insular and less willing to cooperate on global issues. Pope Francis has warned that this retreat into nationalism could have catastrophic consequences, as it undermines the sense of shared responsibility that is essential for addressing the world's most pressing problems, such as poverty, climate change, and conflict. In addition to the growing political divisions within countries, Pope Francis is deeply concerned about the erosion of international cooperation. In the past, the world has been able to come together to address global challenges through multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the Paris Agreement on climate change. However, in recent years, we have seen a disturbing trend of countries withdrawing from these international agreements, undermining the global efforts to tackle issues like climate change, global health, and economic inequality. The withdrawal of major powers from international agreements, such as the US pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord and the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union, has created a dangerous precedent. It signals to the rest of the world that cooperation is no longer a priority and that national interests should take precedence over collective action. Pope Francis has warned that if this trend continues, it could lead to a world where nations are more isolated and less willing to collaborate on solutions to shared problems. The Pope believes that international cooperation is not just a matter of political convenience, but a moral imperative. In a world as interconnected as ours, no country can afford to act alone. The challenges we face, whether environmental, economic, or political, are global in nature, and they require a global response. The political instability and fragmentation we are witnessing today also have deep historical roots. The rise of nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism can be traced back to earlier moments in history when political leaders exploited economic hardship, social unrest, and fear to consolidate power. In many cases, these movements have been fueled by the manipulation of public opinion, the spread of misinformation, and the erosion of trust in democratic institutions. As Pope Francis has pointed out, history is full of examples where political leaders have used division and fear as tools to maintain control, often at the expense of human dignity and the common good. The rise of authoritarian leaders around the world is one of the most alarming signs of political instability. In many countries, leaders are using the pretext of national security, economic crisis, or social unrest to justify crackdowns on political opposition, civil society, and the media. These leaders often seek to concentrate power in their own hands, undermining democratic institutions and curtailing fundamental freedoms. Pope Francis has expressed deep concern about the erosion of democracy and the rise of autocratic regimes that prioritize the interests of the state over the rights and freedoms of individuals. He believes that this trend threatens not only the political stability of nations, but also the moral and ethical foundation of society. In this context, the year 2025 looms large as a pivotal moment in the global political landscape. Pope Francis has warned that by this time, the world may be on the brink of a political crisis of unprecedented proportions. The combination of rising nationalism, political extremism, and the breakdown of international cooperation could lead to a world that is more divided and fragmented than ever before. This, in turn, would create the conditions for widespread social unrest, economic collapse, and even conflict. The Pope's prediction is a sobering reminder of the dangers posed by political instability and the erosion of the values that have held societies together for centuries. Yet Pope Francis remains hopeful that a different path is still possible. He believes that through a renewed commitment to dialogue, cooperation, and mutual respect, humanity can overcome the political divisions that threaten to tear it apart. The Pope calls for a global movement that transcends borders, ideologies, and political affiliations, one that is rooted in the values of solidarity, justice, and the common good. In his view, the solution to political instability lies not in the rise of authoritarianism or the retreat into nationalism, but in a renewed commitment to democracy, human rights, and the pursuit of peace. Ultimately, the future of global politics depends on the choices we make in the coming years. Will we continue down the path of division and fear, or will we choose to embrace the values that unite us as human beings? Pope Francis believes that the latter is possible, but it will require a collective effort to rebuild trust, foster understanding, and prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable. As the political landscape continues to evolve, the Pope's message remains clear. The challenges we face are global in nature, and the solutions must be rooted in solidarity, compassion, and cooperation. The fate of humanity hangs in the balance, and the choices we make today will shape the world we leave for future generations. The environmental crisis has long been a central concern of Pope Francis, who has consistently advocated for stronger action to protect the Earth. In his encyclical Laudato Si', the Pope made a powerful case for environmental stewardship, arguing that the degradation of the environment is intrinsically linked to the social and economic injustices plaguing the world. For Pope Francis, the health of the planet and the health of humanity are inextricably connected, and both are at risk if current trends continue unchecked. In his view, the environmental collapse we are witnessing is not just a series of isolated incidents, but a clear sign of a larger, more profound moral and spiritual crisis. Climate change, deforestation, pollution, loss of biodiversity, these are just a few of the environmental issues that Pope Francis has consistently highlighted. He has repeatedly warned that unless humanity makes a radical shift in its relationship with the natural world, we will face catastrophic consequences. Pope Francis sees the environmental crisis as a result of the global economic system's unchecked exploitation of natural resources for profit. It's a system that prizes short-term gains over long-term sustainability, and one that has led to the destruction of ecosystems, the depletion of vital resources, and the suffering of countless communities around the world. The impacts of climate change are already being felt, and they are only expected to grow more severe in the coming years. Extreme weather events, such as hurricanes, droughts, and wildfires, are becoming more frequent and more intense. The Pope has noted that these disasters disproportionately affect the poor and marginalized, who have the least ability to adapt and recover. In the face of these mounting challenges, Pope Francis has called for a global shift in consciousness, a collective effort to move away from a culture of consumption and exploitation and toward one of care, respect, and sustainability. The idea of integral ecology has been central to his teachings, emphasizing the need for a holistic approach to environmental issues that considers the interconnectedness of all life. One of the most profound aspects of Pope Francis's environmental warning is his assertion that the Earth is not simply a resource to be used, but a sacred trust that humanity is responsible for. He argues that the planet is a gift from God, and it is humanity's duty to protect it for future generations. The environmental crisis, then, is not just a political or scientific issue, it is a deeply moral and spiritual one. Pope Francis calls on people of all faiths, and even those without faith, to recognize the urgency of the situation and to act with a sense of responsibility, compassion, and justice. The Pope's message is clear: the time to act is now, before it's too late. In the coming years, Pope Francis predicts that the environmental crisis will reach a critical point. The damage to the planet will be so severe that it will be impossible to ignore. Droughts will devastate crops, leading to food shortages and rising prices. Coastal communities will be submerged as rising sea levels erode shorelines. The loss of biodiversity will have far-reaching consequences, disrupting ecosystems and diminishing the planet's capacity to support life. And as the effects of climate change intensify, communities around the world will be forced to migrate, creating mass displacement and further fueling conflict and instability. For Pope Francis, the crisis is already upon us, and the window for meaningful action is closing fast. The year 2025 represents a critical juncture, an opportunity to choose a different path, one that prioritizes sustainability, compassion, and the well-being of future generations. But the Pope also warns that if humanity continues to ignore the signs and fail to act decisively, the consequences will be dire. The Pope's message is both a call to action and a warning. The longer we wait to confront the environmental crisis, the more severe the consequences will be. The final chapter of Pope Francis's prediction is centered on the hope that humanity can rise to the challenge and avoid the worst-case scenario. Despite the overwhelming nature of the crisis, Pope Francis remains steadfast in his belief that transformation is possible. He believes that through collective action, a shift in consciousness, and a renewed commitment to justice, we can avert disaster and create a more just and sustainable world. The Pope's message is not one of despair, but one of hope. A hope that, by changing our hearts and minds, we can heal both the planet and ourselves. But this transformation won't come easily. It will require a fundamental shift in the way we think about our relationship with the Earth and with one another. Pope Francis calls for a radical rethinking of the dominant economic system, which he argues has placed profit above people and the planet. This system, driven by consumerism and greed, has created a world where the rich get richer while the poor suffer in silence. The Pope's vision for the future is one where economic systems are restructured to prioritize human dignity, environmental sustainability, and social justice. This means challenging the status quo and pushing for policies that protect the planet, promote equitable economic opportunities, and ensure the well-being of all people, especially the most vulnerable. The transformation that Pope Francis envisions is not just a political or economic one, it is a spiritual one as well. At the heart of his message is the idea of love. Love for the earth, love for one another, and love for future generations. The Pope believes that by cultivating a sense of interconnectedness and solidarity, humanity can overcome the divisions and conflicts that have driven the world to the brink of collapse. He calls for a global movement of people committed to living in harmony with the earth and each other, a movement that transcends borders, religions, and ideologies. This movement, he believes, can bring about the healing that the world so desperately needs. Pope Francis also emphasizes the importance of personal transformation in this process. He urges individuals to reflect on their own lives and consider how their actions impact the planet and those around them. Small changes, such as reducing waste, conserving energy, and supporting sustainable practices, can have a ripple effect that extends far beyond the individual. But he also calls for larger-scale changes, political, economic, and social changes, that can reshape the world on a systemic level. In the face of overwhelming challenges, Pope Francis offers a vision of hope and redemption. While the path ahead may be difficult, he believes that humanity can overcome the crisis if we are willing to change our hearts and minds. The Pope's message is clear. We have the power to shape the future, and it is up to us to choose whether we will rise to the occasion or allow the world to slip further into chaos. The choice is ours, and the time to act is now. The prediction for 2025 is not a prophecy of doom, but a call to action, a reminder that the future is not set in stone and that we have the power to shape it. The choices we make in the coming years will determine the future of the planet and the survival of humanity. Pope Francis urges us to choose wisely, to embrace solidarity and compassion, and to act with urgency to protect the earth and its inhabitants. The path forward is uncertain, but with faith, hope, and a commitment to justice, it is possible to create a better world for all.